Hello everybody, this is Civil War reading video number 3, and I'm going to be reading to you a story called Escape to Freedom by Kenneth Franklin, and there's a little bit of the illustration you can see, and it's a really interesting story, I think, and it's actually based on a true story. So this is Escape to Freedom. Smalls, today and Saturday are going to be busy days, stated Captain Aurelia, captain of the Confederate gunboat Planter. We have to go down to the Stono River and pick up some guns at Coles Island. The guns are needed for Fort Ripley in case the Union forces get past Fort Sumter. Now, we all know where Fort Sumter was. It's in the bay outside Charleston. Yes, sir, Captain, replied Smalls, the black pilot for the Planter. You can count on us to get the job done. Smalls spoke calmly, his voice hiding the real excitement that ran through him. Months before, a plan had formed in Smalls' mind, a plan that would carry his family and him to freedom. The American Civil War was a little over a year old. All along the Atlantic coast, slaves were being freed by Union forces. Outside the range of Charleston's guns, a Union blockade kept the Charleston harbor locked. Now, if you remember, the term blockade means that there were boats that were lined up, keeping anybody from going into the harbor and keeping anybody from coming out of the harbor. If only he could get his family and crew safely to the Union forces. He would wear Captain Aurelia's wide-brimmed straw hat and stand in the pilot's cabin. Under cover of darkness, sentries could easily mistake him for the swarthy Captain Aurelia. All right, a couple of words here I want to point out. Sentries is another name for guards. And swarthy, that's one of those million-dollar words. Anytime you're writing about someone who has sort of dark skin, maybe really tanned skin, not necessarily an African-American dark black skin, but maybe just a lighter brownish skin. Sometimes they use the word swarthy to describe someone whose like nationality is Spanish, or maybe they have been out in the sun a really long time and have a really, really dark tan. But he had to get ashore and tell Hannah. She would have to be ready to go at a moment's notice. The families of the crew would also have to be told when and where they were to go on board the Planter. Captain, I know we are rushed, but I was wondering if I could go ashore and see Hannah and the baby before we sail, asked Smalls. He hasn't been well, and it'll be a few days before I see them again. Smalls, it's against regulations to let you go, but we can't leave for another 2 hours. So I guess it's all right. But be back in 2 hours, warned the captain. And we all know that the word regulations means it's against the rules. Bob Smalls ran down the gangway, that's the little ramp that goes from the ship, and headed for his home. As he walked past the idle merchant ships, Smalls noticed the position of each one. The Etowah is the best, he thought. The deckhands will hide the women and children until we take them on board the Planter. Reaching home, he ran quickly up the stairs. Hannah, he cried excitedly as he ran into the room, be ready to go on Monday night. While the captain and his mates are at that fancy ball for the naval officers, we can sail to freedom aboard the Planter. But Bob, it's so dangerous, cautioned Hannah. No more so than staying in Charleston as slaves, wondering if we're going to be pinned up somewhere. I was born a slave, but I aim to live or die a free man, rather than a slave in Charleston. The excitement in his voice and the shine of freedom in his eyes carried away Hannah's fears, and she knew that despite the dangers, she would follow Bob. Quickly, Bob explained the plan that gave her directions on how to get to the Etowah and whom she should talk to. "Tell the others that once they start, there is no turning back," said Bob. "If caught, we are going to scuttle the ship and jump into the bay." Scuttle means to deliberately sink the ship, and sometimes in war situations, captains would scuttle the ship if they did not want their enemy to get the ship. But in this case, Bob would scuttle the ship so that there would be no evidence of what had taken place. "I have to get back to the ship now. I won't have a chance to see you until Monday night when you come aboard ship. Be careful." Hours later, Smalls noted the details of the harbor more closely than he had ever done before. For the last 6 years, he had been a pilot guiding boats through the treacherous waters of the harbor. And remember, the word treacherous means dangerous. He knew every nook and cranny, every current of waters in the bay, but he wanted to be sure. You don't hear those terms nook and cranny too much anymore, but it just means every little tiny spot that he could know. He knew it. This time, everything his family and crew had hoped for would rest on Small's ability to guide the planter through the night, past the sentries and the guns of the mighty forts. "Smalls, get your men ready," ordered Captain Relia. "We're coming into Coles Island now. You and the men are to start dismantling the guns and carrying them to the pier." The rest of Friday and all of Saturday was spent in bringing the guns down to the pier. Captain Relia kept after the men to hurry, but nothing seemed to go right. Sunday, the planter sailed back to Charleston without the guns. As the boat pulled into her berth, Captain Relia called Smalls over. "Make sure we have a supply of wood for the return trip to Coles Island tonight. We have to get the guns loaded tomorrow and unloaded at Fort Ripley by evening. The mates and I want to attend the dance tomorrow evening." The men, under Small's direction, soon had the ship ready to sail. Wood and supplies were aboard, and all the equipment needed to load the heavy guns was checked over. Sunday evening, the planter sailed again for Coles Island. Monday, May 13th, 1862. Now, you know, whenever a specific date is listed in a passage to read, the author wants to point out that that's an important date. So Monday, May 13th, 1862, dawned bright and clear. Captain Relia felt confident that he would be able to get the guns loaded and transported to Fort Ripley and still get back to Charleston. But plans other than Captain Relia's were also in effect. All day the men worked to load the cannons. Nothing seemed to go right for them. Ropes would come loose and a cannon would slip back down the pier. Alfred Graydene slipped and stopped to check his twisted ankle, but he was soon on his feet, working with only a slight, quote, limp, end quote. "Smalls," bellowed the captain, "what are you men doing down there? This isn't a picnic. Get busy on the tackle." Turning to his first mate, Captain Relia grumbled, "A good whipping probably wouldn't hurt any of that crew. We'll never get those cannons to Fort Ripley tonight." Late Monday afternoon, Smalls called up to the captain. "We're all set, sir." "It's about time, too," cried Relia angrily. "Get this ship underway. We won't make Fort Ripley tonight. We'll just make it back to Charleston." "Yes, sir, Captain, I understand. The men just haven't been feeling right. But a good rest in Charleston will put them back into shape. They'll be different men by this time tomorrow," Smalls replied calmly. I hope you see what's happening here. Think about all these things that have been going wrong. As the steamer moved out into the Stono River, it seemed that the crew began to move faster and with more confidence than they had had all day. Everything was running according to plan. Small's plan. That evening, the planter was left in Small's command. The ship was silent, except for the creak of boards and the gentle slap of water against the sides. The 4-man crew, Robert Smalls, his brother John Smalls, Will Morrison, and Alfred Graydene, sat quietly, awaiting the night. There were food supplies and plenty of wood for the boiler. Each man sat with his own hopes and fears. Darkness settled over Charleston. "All's well," came the sentry's cry. Darkness fell deeper across the harbor. Shadows began to move aboard the Planter. Smalls and Grey Dean broke into the captain's cabin and found guns, charts, and the broad-brimmed hat. The hat that would be their ticket through the blockade or to burial. "All's well, 11 o'clock," cried the sentry. A thin cloud of smoke floated out of the stack. The Planter backed carefully away from the wharf and out into the harbor. The darkened ship moved slowly past idle merchant ships. No challenging cry came from the sentries. "John, we're over the first hurdle," Smalls said. "Now, help Will get the boat ready. He'll row over to the Etowah and pick up the women and children." "Okay, but shouldn't we wrap the oars so they don't squeak as he rows?" asked John. Here's a little illustration on this part of the page. Good thinking. We don't want to disturb any guards that might be on the other ships. Remember, we're all dead men if we get caught, warned Bob. Now, the text keeps going back and forth between calling Robert Smalls Bob. So you have to kind of keep up with who is who here. The Planter stopped and anchored close by the Etowah. Soon the boat was in the water and on its way to pick up the families of the crew. The Planter pulled against the anchor chain as if she too wanted to be away from the danger. We always refer to boats as she's. They're always referred to as females. The men strained to see through the dark of night. I don't know why, by the way. Where was the boat with their families? Had the plan been discovered? Should Bob sink the ship and all their hopes for freedom? "I think I hear them," whispered Alfred. The muffled sounds of a boat cutting through the water reached the Planter. "But are the women and children in it?" he asked cautiously. "Planter! Ahoy! The Planter!" came Will's voice. "It's them! Get 'em aboard the ship quickly," ordered Bob. "And then get a full head of steam up." Smalls felt like cheering, but any celebration would have to wait until they were all safely away from Confederate control. The anchor was raised. Smoke poured out of the stack as the Planter swung out into the main harbor current. Fort Ripley loomed off to the left. The fort's sentries watched. The Planter moved quickly past, and they thought nothing about it. Fort Johnson on the right was passed without a challenge. The pounding of the steam engine and the rush of water past the ship's hull were the only sounds heard aboard the Planter. Even the children sensed the danger and sat quietly in the quarters below deck. That means the little cabins, the quarters. Bob Smalls stood quietly at the window of the pilot house. "I'll have to take us through the shallow channel between Fort Sumter and Morris Island," he said to John. "There are too many obstructions in the channel between Sumter and Fort Moultrie." The eastern sky was beginning to show signs of the morning as the Planter steamed slowly toward Fort Sumter. Would there be too much light when they approached Sumter, thought Bob? What if there are new orders about travel or possibly a new password? Despite these fears, Smalls kept the ship heading toward the huge guns of Fort Sumter. Bob turned the wheel over to John and leaned on the windowsill of the pilot house. He pulled the brim of the straw hat lower so that his face was shadowed in the dim light of dawn that seemed to get even brighter. "Keep her steady as she goes," said Bob calmly. "We're almost in hailing distance." That means where you would, signal to somebody. Reducing speed as required by naval regulations, the Planter pulled to within voice range of the sentries. His stomach knotted. Bob reached for the cord to the whistle. 3 short blasts and then one long hiss of escaping steam. "The gunboat Planter has given the proper signal," cried the sentry. "Pass the Planter," replied the corporal of the guard. "We have passed," Smalls called down to the crew. In the engine room and below decks, the crew and their families stifled cheers of celebration. That means they kept from yelling out, "Woo, yay!" They stifled them. They stopped them. And here's an illustration here of them going through the forts. Albert and Will shoved more wood into the furnace. The steam pressure began to climb. Smoke poured from the stack as the planter gained speed. 1 mile. Fort Sumter's guns were being left behind. Ahead lay the safety and freedom of the Union blockade. The sentries stared at the speeding planter. "Corporal of the guard! Corporal of the guard!" cried the sentry. "Something is wrong about the planter." Uh-oh. Drama. Bob and his crew heard the call to arms at Sumter, but the call came too late. Safely out of range of the huge guns, the planter and her crew were gone. Bob steered for the Union forces, heading for the lead ship. Down came the Confederate flag, and up went a white bedsheet, a flag of truce. That meant that they were signaling the Union ships that they were coming in peace. But the Union ships were turning their guns on the speeding planter. Bob heard the sound of drums. Uh-oh, more drama. "What does it mean?" asked John. "Those drums are calling the men to their battle stations," replied Bob. "I hope we aren't going to be blown out of the water this close to freedom." Turning to look up at the truce flag, he exclaimed, "No wonder they have the guns on us. The flag isn't billowing out, and they can't see it in this early morning light." Then, as though the free winds heard him, personification, a breeze rippled through the waters and lifted the sheet out for the Union ships to see. And there is the illustration. The Union commander ordered his men to hold their fire. "Ahoy, steamer! Who are you and what is your business?" "The planter, out of Charleston, come to join the Union fleet," cried Smalls, over the cheers of his crew. The race for freedom was over. The crew and their families were free. The story of Robert Smalls could have ended at that point. But on that spring night in 1862, Robert Smalls sailed into the pages of history. He served the Union forces throughout the remainder of the war. After the war, he worked to build a better government for all the people of South Carolina. So he actually got to serve in South Carolina's government. Even up until his death in 1915. That wasn't that long ago. Robert Smalls was a constant champion for freedom. Born a slave, he kept his promise that he would die a free man. The end. So that's a great story. It's based on a true story, and it just goes to show you that there were people who were able to live their dreams and to make it to freedom and then want to come back and make things better for where they grew up. And so Robert Smalls, very famous South Carolinian. So, bye.